are part of Wainfleet's, Lincolnshire's and indeed British culture, and Batemans brewing roots go back to 1874 when our original brew house was commissioned by George and Susanna Bateman. Many people enjoy Batemans beers, so over the next few minutes we'd like to highlight the quality, care and imagination that goes into brewing the perfect Batemans pint. We're going to explain generally how beer is brewed, but also offer an insight into how Batemans beers in particular are created today. To do that, we're going to introduce you to the variables within the normal brewing process that give Batemans beers their distinctive taste and character. The basic brewing process involves 7 distinct stages: selection of ingredients, milling, mashing, hopping, fermenting, conditioning and racking. But before we go through those, it's important to understand that whilst the 7 stages are common to many breweries, Batemans employ a number of important variables within each stage of the brewing journey to give our beers their edge. The first, and arguably the most important stage of the brewing process, is the selection of only the finest ingredients. These ingredients have basically remained the same since we started brewing at Salem Bridge 145 years ago. The foundations of our beers are water from Lincolnshire's Covenham Reservoir and a selection of the highest quality malted barley sourced mainly from producers in Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. We then choose hops for the majority of our beer range from British and American growers who produce traditional varieties like Golding, Challenger, Chinook, Bramling and Cascade. Finally, Bateman's much sought after yeast is an ingredient that's been passed down from head brewer to head brewer for over 145 years. Using a modern generation of our original parent yeast is critical, as it's the source of as much as 60% of the flavour of the finished beer. So as you can see, the ingredients we use are very high quality and in the case of the yeast, utterly unique to us. Now, we're going to explain a bit more about stage 2, the milling of the malt. In our brew house, the malted barley is milled in our 80-year-old Bowby malt mill. The milling process breaks up the grain kernels so that we can extract the fermentable sugars from the malts. Milled malted barley is called grist, and the grist that comes from the mill is stored and then mixed together with the brewing liquor in the mash tun. The exact quantities of grist and brewing liquor will depend on the beer to be brewed. As the grist and the brewing liquor are mixed in the mash tun, natural enzymes break the starch in the grist down into fermentable sugars. Our brewing liquor is one of those variables we mentioned earlier, and Bateman's brewing liquor is pure Lincolnshire water that we treat to get critical elements within the liquid to the right levels. The important thing to understand is that there's a distinct difference between tap water that's full of additions like fluoride and Bateman's brewing liquor, which is the quality controlled liquid that we use to brew our beers. The mash tun we use for the majority of our beers is housed in a state-of-the-art area of the brew house known as our Theatre of Beers. Opened in 2002 by Roger Protz, one of the world's best-known beer writers, our Theatre of Beers helps our brewers to produce products of a consistent quality, taste and character. So, just to recap, we take the finest malted barley from Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire and mill it into grist before mixing the grist with our brewing liquor in the mash tun to release those fermentable sugars. The liquid that's created in the mash tun is called wort, and the wort is now transferred into the brewing copper for stage 4 of the brewing process, hopping. Hops are added to the wort in the copper and the resulting mix is brought to a controlled boil for approximately 45 minutes. The exact timings depend on the recipe for the beer being brewed, and the specific hop recipe for each beer is another carefully guarded secret. One Bateman specific element we can reveal is that we sometimes add the hops to the wort in 2 separate stages, after mashing and during fermentation. Rather than sieving the hops from the wort as some brewers do, Bateman's copper actually creates a whirlpool that uses centrifugal force to keep the used hops in the centre of the vessel, while the clear hopped wort is siphoned off, cooled and piped into our traditional open top square fermenters for stage 5 of the process. And this is where the real magic of brewing happens: fermentation. To start fermentation, Batemans Yeast Fermentation Supervisor will introduce a strain of our own yeast into the open-top fermenters. The yeast turns the fermentable sugars in the wort into alcohol. It adds very specific flavours, and it also produces carbon dioxide, which gives our beer its sparkle. The open-top fermenters are another of our special Batemans variables, and were installed by Mr. George in 1953. To put them into context, it's worth understanding that most brewers used a closed fermenting tank for mass production and to speed the fermentation process. Our open-top vessels allow us to take our time and let nature take its course. They give us three important advantages over the closed systems. Firstly, they allow for a fuller fermentation and more natural maturation of the beer. Secondly, the open tops allow us to add exotic ingredients such as orange zest, dark fruits, elderflower, strawberry, or even to add more hops for extra aroma. We'll often employ this option for the special brews that we dream up from time to time. And finally, the open tops allow us to harvest the viable yeast that accumulates on top of the fermenting liquid, a process called skimming, and we use this yeast in future brews. Batemans yeast is so active that the fermentation process can actually be finished in as little as 2 days. To achieve the required alcohol content, which you may have heard of referred to as ABV, our brewers test the beer at regular intervals and then skim the yeast from the fermenters at the correct time. What is now called green beer is taken from the open tops to our conditioning vessels for stage 6 of the brewing process, conditioning. Conditioning, or maturation of the beer, allows the full development of flavours and ensures the beer has a perfectly smooth finish. This process starts in the conditioning vessels but is actually completed after the beer has been racked. The time it takes to properly condition a beer completely depends on the beer being brewed. And then in the 7th and final stage, the beer is transferred or racked into 9-gallon casks where the conditioning of the beer continues as the casks are taken on the dray to be enjoyed in your favourite Batemans pub. You can see that whilst the 7-stage brewing process, raw material selection, milling, mashing, hopping, fermenting, conditioning and racking, is similar in most breweries, Batemans beers gain their distinct qualities by combining the variables we've introduced you to in a variety of recipes that remain closely guarded secrets. So that's the 7-stage brewing process and the unique Batemans elements. To finish off, we'd just like to draw your attention to one more interesting feature that you'll see at the brewery. During a visit to the brewery, you'll notice that as well as our modern theatre of beers, we've also maintained the traditional Victorian brew house exactly as it was built in 1874, with its original mash tun and copper. This part of the brewery allows us to continue the heritage of brewing that's happened on this site for 145 years. And we can only maintain these facilities because Batemans is a proud and independent family business that's run by brewers and not accountants. So there you have it. As you sit enjoying your pint, we hope that you'll now be able to appreciate not just how beer is made, but the quality, care and imagination that Stuart Bateman and the brewery team put into making Batemans beers in particular.